If you want to have a professional sounding mix, you'll need to have some width. While some of that happens in the mastering phase, it's best not to depend on the mastering engineer fixing your too narrow sound. Let's talk about some ways to get increased width in your mixes. Hi, I'm Keith from No Label, No Producer, No Limits.com. Let's dive right in. There's a sometimes overlooked area in recording that can really enhance stereo width, and that's arrangement. So how do you arrange songs for enhanced width, especially in choruses? Let's explore. In general, in a mix, the low end stays in the center, as well as the instruments that need the most attention and focus, such as lead vocals. For a rock band, for instance, that means that the kick drum, the bass guitar, the snare, and the lead vocals or other lead instruments are mostly in the center. You might widen these with stereo effects a little bit, but the main energy is right up the center. Guitars, keyboards, cymbals, backup vocals, and other instruments can be panned away from the center, and as a very loose guideline, the higher the frequency, the wider you can go with the panning. The brain localizes sound with high frequencies. Low frequencies are kind of bendy and they move around everything, so it's harder to tell where they come from. High frequencies are very localized, and so if they're panned out wide, it sounds like they're panned out wide. It doesn't do you a lot of good to pan low frequency instruments out. But that's a very loose guideline. I mean, you can have guitars panned hard left and hard right, it's fine. It can also be good to have instruments of similar frequency ranges panned opposite of each other. So if you have a mid-rangey guitar that's going ant and a keyboard that's also ant, consider panning them to opposite sides. So those are some basic guidelines. Now you can think about this in the studio, but better yet, start thinking of your arrangements before you hit record. When you're creating the instrumental arrangements in the first place, think about where each instrument is going in the stereo field. Talk to your banjo player, your violin player, your marimba player, and figure out where they're going to be placed in the stereo perspective. Make sure that parts aren't interfering with each other. Make sure you have a balance of high frequencies on either side, for instance. Now, it's also good to think about your verses, choruses, bridges, and other parts of your song with regard to width. In general, choruses are the biggest sounding parts of a song and should therefore have lots of width. But what are you going to do to ensure width in the choruses? Will additional instruments come in and be panned hard? Will the drummer switch from the hi-hat to the ride? And typically the hi-hat is just a little left of center from the drummer's perspective and the ride is pretty far to the right. Will backup vocals come in and give a chance to add some width? Think about that stuff ahead of time. Now, one of the most common ways to get width is to double parts. Rhythm guitar can be played twice or even several times, and the guitar parts can be panned away from each other. I'd suggest experimenting with panning the guitars out further during the choruses for more width. I also think about adding different voicings of a chord and panning. One trick I sometimes use, although this is more something I use with arpeggios than chords usually, is I'll copy a part, shift the copy up an octave, and pan the octave away from the original track. If I have two instruments I do this with, I'll pan the high parts away from each other very wide, and the original parts away from each other, but not quite as wide. So for instance, to the left, I'll have guitar 1 and keyboard octave. To the right, I'll have keyboard 1 and guitar octave. With guitars, I'll often split the guitar, verses, and chorus parts out in order to make it easier to change the panning. I can either automate the pan on one track or just pan the chorus guitars out harder. You can also use effects such as chorus, phase, and flange to give you width or a general perception of width. And finally, there are stereo widening plugins such as Wider, which can add width. I tend to use widening plugins on buses and not on the mix as a whole, unless I'm in the mastering phase and need more width. One reason for this is that variances are what keeps a recording interesting. Adding width overall in a mix makes the bigger parts sound bigger, but it also makes the parts that you meant to sound small and intimate bigger. So better to do it on a bus, let's say on instruments that come in only in the chorus, for example. Let's take a look at how I widened out a guitar in the mix. The mix isn't finished yet, but I have mostly finished working with this guitar here. It's from a song of mine called Stanislaw Lem, and here is the original guitar plugged straight into my audio interface, and you'll hear what it sounds like. Not very sexy, Moneypenny. Now up here we have a meter that'll show us how wide it is stereo-wise. It's M Stereoscope from Melda Productions. It's free. And you can see that line just means that there ain't nothing going on in the stereo perspective. It's panned off to the left, but you got no width. Okay, so then I added a little bit of a delay and panned that to the other side. Let's hear what that sounds like. Now we have a little bit of width going on. Let's hear just the delay. Okay, now back to the width meter, and let's see what that does to the width. Now, as you can see, the delay is panned hard right. We've got the original guitar panned a little bit to the left, and now we have more of an oval shape here in the guitar. Okay, now that's not the sound I wanted anyway, so we're going to change it a little more. I put CLA guitars on this guitar, which is a plug-in for guitar sounds. It's set up to sound a little bit more like an amp, and it has a reverb, a delay, and a stereo spreader, which are all going to add to the stereo-ness of this guitar. Here we go. And now we're round as all get out. Now, that's not really what you want in an overall mix. In general, you want a nice oval shape, but not round. Now, one more thing I did. Let's take a look at what I did with the keyboard. I added a keyboard part, which is a little bit different voicing than the guitar, but it's the same chords. Let's listen to that. And now in with the guitars. And now let's hear what the whole part sounds like a little bit. Now, as you can hear there, really the only movement across the stereo field and the only width is the guitar, because the drums are mostly hi-hat, kick, and snare. The bass is laying out. We don't have any vocals in there at this point. So we really need a little bit of width in the guitar to get that happening as a mix. Of course, the chorus pops the width out even more, but I want to go to another chorus in another song to show you some other stuff. Here we have another song called Every Love Song, and it starts off with driving guitars and a drum and bass groove. We'll just play you the first couple bars of it here.
Girl, you've got something about you. You know I can't resist. And when I look into your eyes, whoa.
So in general, your mix should be floating around here about 66%, about 2/3 width. And that it's generally good to stay up in there. And you could see here, I'm well below 33%. So we're probably going to have to get some additional width in here somehow. Although this is the verse and it's not the wide part of the song. Let's take a listen to what the guitars are doing here. So you can hear that the guitars are panned hard left and right here. I probably did that, because it wasn't getting a lot of width in that verse. Normally I would pan those up a little bit tighter and wait for the chorus or the pre-chorus to expand it out. Here they are on the scope. Okay, so that's what the guitars look like on the scope, and that looks okay to me. Now let's see what happens in the pre-chorus.
But there's one thing you should realize. Whoa, can't you see? Every line of poetry, every romance ever written was meant for you and me. Every romance.
It's not as driving as the verse, it's a little more flowy, so I want it to widen out a little bit. Let's see what I did here. I had some keyboards. Well, let's listen to basically the music. So it's got all that flowy stuff, and then it heads back into the tighter verses. So let's take a listen to the guitars that I did right there. Now there you hear it. There's an octave guitar in there. Okay, so I'm going to play a little bit of the original guitar. Here it is, and then we'll play the octave. Okay, you can see that the original guitar here is panned off to about 27%. Let's play this. Okay, now let's hear the octave guitar, which is, let me guess, panned hard to the other side. Almost. It's panned at about 75%. So this is my little trick to create an octave double of a part and then pan them out. Here we go, see if it adds some width to you. And as you could see there, it was somewhat canted toward the left side of the stereo field. I've got some keys that are creating those same high frequencies on the other side of the field, and therefore we have a little bit wider sound in that pre-chorus. Let's see what a widening plugin would do on our final mix. I'm going to add wider, and I'm going to put it before the stereoscope so we can see.
Girl, you've got something about you. You know I can't resist. And when I look into your eyes, whoa, I just melt and there's no doubt you've got the best of me. But there's one thing you should realize. Whoa, can't you see? Every line of poetry, every romance ever written was meant for you and me. Every Romeo, every Juliet.
And as you can see, the plugin gets us closer to our target in terms of width, but it really kind of screws with the mix, especially the elements in the center. So I wouldn't use it there. However, let's see what happens if I use it on a part that only comes in the chorus. Now I could hear this on the keyboards perhaps. Let's take a listen. Let's listen to it in the context of the mix.
Realize, whoa, can't you see? Every line of poetry, every romance ever written was meant for you and me. Every Romeo, every Juliet, every love song that you can't forget. Every time
So that does give us a little more width in the pre-chorus, but frankly, I don't like it very much. You have to be very judicious with these widening plugins. If you're only listening to the width of the mix, you think it sounds wonderful, it sounds big, but it's really going to screw you up in other areas. So just add a little touch here and there. I remember as I mastered this, I did get some additional width with some mid-side processing, which we're not going to talk about today. But those are some ideas about how to get width in the mix through arrangement. But the number one tip is to think about stereo panning and stereo width, where the instruments are going to go in the stereo field before you hit the recording studio, and get that all planned out. If you found this video useful or liked it in any way, hit like, subscribe. We'll be right back at you with some more videos. I'm Keith from No Label, No Producer, No Limits.com. We'll see you soon.